Welcome, friends. Tonight, we step quietly into the rugged, windswept hills of the Scottish Highlands, a place where history's harshest shadows still linger. Imagine a time just after the Battle of Cullode, when the land itself seemed to hold its breath and everyday life was tangled with fear, loss, and relentless hardship. The echoes of war faded, but the struggle for survival only deepened. Families were torn apart, traditions crushed, and laws imposed that reshaped the very way people lived. The quiet glens and ancient stone cottages became places of silent endurance, where resilience was tested daily by cold, hunger, and the weight of oppression. Tonight, you'll hear the stories of those who faced this brutal new world, stories of sorrow and strength, of shattered communities and stubborn hope. Settle in, take a slow breath, and let the misty highland winds carry you gently back to a time when life was raw, difficult, and fiercely alive. This is why life was brutal in the Highlands after Cullode, and more. Welcome to the journey. In the days and weeks that followed the battle on Cullode Moor, a profound and unsettling quiet began to settle over the Highlands. It was not the quiet of peace, nor the gentle hush of a landscape at rest. It was an expectant silence, heavy with foreboding, broken only by the whisper of the wind across the heather and the distant, mournful cry of a curlew. The sharp, brutal noise of the battle itself, the roar of cannon, the clash of steel, the screams of the fallen, had lasted less than an hour. But the retribution that followed would unfold over months and years, a slow, grinding process that began not with a sound, but with a sight. It began with smoke. Across the great glen, and throughout the lands of the clans who had supported the Jacobite cause, thin grey plumes began to rise against the slate-colored sky. At first, they were isolated signals, seen from a distant hill or a hidden clachan, but soon they multiplied, becoming a haze that softened the sharp edges of the mountains and filled the glens with a bitter, acrid scent. This was not the familiar, comforting smoke of a peat fire rising from a cottage hearth. This was the smoke of systematic destruction, a deliberate and chilling message from the victorious Hanoverian government and its commander, the Duke of Cumberland. His soldiers, known as redcoats, were given orders that were both simple and terrible: to pacify the Highlands, to ensure that no such rebellion could ever rise again. The targets of this policy were the homes of the Highlanders themselves. These were not grand stone castles, but humble dwellings known as black houses or tidus. Their walls were made of thick, double-layered dry stone packed with earth and turf for insulation. The roofs were timber frames covered in sod and a deep layer of heather thatch, which gave them a shaggy, organic appearance, as if they had grown directly from the land itself. Inside, a central hearth was the heart of the home, its smoke finding its way out through a simple hole in the roof. These homes were dark, smoky, and simple, but they were the centers of life, warmth, and family. They held everything a family owned: a few wooden stools, some blankets, a pot for cooking, and perhaps a cherished heirloom passed down through generations. To the soldiers, these homes were little more than primitive hovels, tinderboxes waiting for a spark. Marching through the glens, they moved with a cold efficiency. A torch was thrust into the dry heather of the roof, and within moments the home would be engulfed in flames. The fire would consume the timber beams, the precious thatch, and everything inside. The heat would become so intense that the stones of the walls would sometimes crack and split, leaving behind a skeletal ruin. What was not burned was often smashed or carried away. The soldiers' work was thorough. They left nothing. For the families who had fled to the hills to hide, the sight of that smoke on the horizon was a confirmation of their worst fears. It meant they had nothing to return to. Imagine standing on a high ridge, wrapped in a damp plaid against the biting wind, watching as the glen that had been your home for generations slowly disappeared under a blanket of smoke. Each plume represented a life upended, a family cast out, history erased. The smoke mingled with the low-hanging mist, blurring the line between earth and sky, between destruction and the natural state of the Highland weather. It was a surreal and heartbreaking sight. The smoke carried on the wind for miles, an unmistakable signal to all who saw it. The old ways were over. Resistance was not just futile, it was being burned out of the very soil. The landscape itself seemed to absorb the trauma. The vibrant green of the spring grass was blackened with soot. The clear, cold water of the burns ran grey with ash for days. The air, usually so clean and sharp, was thick and difficult to breathe, tasting of ruin. Even the animals were affected. The cattle and sheep that hadn't been driven off by the soldiers would wander aimlessly through the devastation, their familiar pastures now barren and strange. The bird song that usually filled the morning air was replaced by an eerie stillness. The land itself was in a state of shock, a silent witness to the methodical destruction of the life it had sustained. When the fires finally died down, what was left was an even more profound emptiness. The smoke gave way to a landscape of black skeletal ruins. A solitary gable end might stand against the sky, a jagged monument to what was a home. A circular foundation of stones, now filled with rainwater and debris, marked the spot where a family had gathered round their hearth for centuries. These were not just burned buildings. They were open wounds on the face of the land. They were the physical embodiment of a broken people. The silence that followed the smoke was different from the silence that had come before. It was the silence of absence, the laughter of children, the murmur of Gaelic conversation, the bleating of sheep being brought in for the night. All of it was gone. All that remained was the wind, whistling through the empty doorways and rattling the charred remains of a roof beam. This was the new sound of the Highlands, a deep, resonant emptiness. The smoke on the moor was the first chapter in a long, slow story of loss, a visual prologue to the quiet famine, the cultural suppression, and the great dispersal that was to come. It was a sign that the soul of the Highlands was being systematically extinguished, one hearth, one home, one glen at a time. The moor was no longer a place of life, but a place of ghosts and memory, forever stained by the lingering scent of smoke. Before Cullode, life in the Highlands was woven from a single powerful thread, the clan. The word itself, from the Gaelic clan, means children or offspring. It was a concept that went far deeper than a mere social or political alliance. To belong to a clan, a MacDonald, a Cameron, a Fraser, a MacLeod, was to know exactly who you were. It was your identity, your family, your social safety net, and your system of law and order all in one. The clan was a vast, sprawling family, with a chief at its head who was seen not as a landlord or a distant ruler, but as the father of his people, the patriarch of the extended family. His authority was rooted in centuries of shared ancestry, real or mythological, that bound the highest chief to the lowliest crofter. This intricate system of kinship was the bedrock of Highland society. It dictated who you married, where you lived, and to whom you owed your loyalty. In times of plenty, the clan provided support and community. In times of hardship, it offered protection. When a neighboring clan raided your cattle, it was your chief and your kinsmen who rode with you to reclaim them. The rent paid to a chief was often not in coin, which was scarce, but in kind, with cattle, grain or military service. It was a reciprocal relationship. The clansmen gave their loyalty and service, and in return, the chief provided land, leadership, and protection. It was a system that had endured for 1,000 years, shaping the very landscape and the people who lived upon it. The names of the great clans were tied to specific glens and islands, their stories etched into the mountains and lochs. In the aftermath of Culloden, the British government saw this system not as a form of social organization, but as the engine of rebellion. The clan, with its fierce loyalties and its private armies, was deemed a direct threat to the authority of the state. And so, with a series of deliberate and calculated acts, the government set out to shatter it. The goal was not just to punish the clans who had risen for the Jacobites, but to break the very concept of the clan itself, to atomize Highland society and replace kinship with obedience to a distant, centralized government. The first and most direct blow was the Act of Prescription of 1746. This sweeping legislation contained several clauses, but one of the most significant was the abolition of the heritable jurisdictions. For centuries, clan chiefs had held the power of pit and gallows, the right to hold their own courts, to dispense justice, and even to carry out executions within their own territories. This power was now stripped away. Justice was no longer a matter for the clan chief in his hall, surrounded by his kinsmen. It was to be administered by state-appointed sheriffs and judges in formal courtrooms, conducted in English, a language many Highlanders did not understand. In a single stroke, the chief was demoted from a patriarchal ruler to a simple landlord, his authority nullified. He could no longer protect his people, and his people no longer owed him their traditional service. The ancient bonds of mutual obligation were severed by law. This legal change had a profound psychological impact. The entire social structure, the ladder of status and respect that every Highlander understood, was kicked away. The men who had been the pillars of their community, the tacksmen, who leased large areas of land from the chief and sublet them to the common clansmen, suddenly found their role obsolete. They were no longer the vital link in the chain of command, the lieutenants of the clan. They were just tenants on a piece of land. The sense of belonging, of having a place in a well-understood hierarchy, was gone. People were left adrift, their loyalties confused. Who was in charge now? A red-coated soldier? A faceless official in Edinburgh or London? The breaking of the clans was also the breaking of names. The clan name itself, a source of immense pride, became a mark of suspicion. A MacDonald or a Cameron was now, in the eyes of the government, a potential traitor. The collective identity that had been a source of strength was turned into a liability. Families began to scatter. Without the protection of the chief and the structure of the clan, the old ways of cooperation fell apart. Communities that had worked together to plant crops, herd cattle, and build homes found themselves fragmented and isolated. The spirit of mutual support was replaced by a grim struggle for individual survival. This fragmentation was accelerated by the government's practice of forfeiture. The lands of many Jacobite chiefs were confiscated by the crown. These estates were then managed by government-appointed factors, men who had no connection to the people or the land. Their goal was not to act as fathers to the clan, but to extract the maximum economic value from the estates. Rents were demanded in cash, not in kind, forcing many into a new and unfamiliar world of monetary debt. The traditional, personal relationship between the chief and his people was replaced by a cold, impersonal economic transaction. The land was no longer the shared inheritance of the clan, it was an asset to be exploited. The very soul of the Highland way of life was being hollowed out. The great gatherings of the clan, the storytelling around the fire, the recitation of epic poems celebrating the deeds of ancestors, these traditions began to fade. Without the social structure to support them, they lost their context and their meaning.
The breaking of the clans was not just a political act, it was a cultural one. It aimed to erase a collective memory and replace it with a new, state-sanctioned identity. The people of the Highlands were no longer to be Camerons or Frasers. They were to be North Britons, subjects of King George. But for a people whose entire world had been defined by kinship, this new identity felt empty and alien. They had lost more than their leaders. They had lost their way of life, their sense of self. The broken clans left behind a society of broken names, a people unmoored from their past and uncertain of their future, wandering in the ruins of a world that had been shattered overnight. A weapon was far more than just a tool for fighting. It was a symbol of status, a mark of a free man, and an essential part of his identity. To carry a broadsword at one side, a dirk, a long dagger, tucked into a stocking, and a targe, a studded leather shield slung over the shoulder, was to declare one's place in society. These were not just implements of war, they were the articles of a gentleman, the birthright of every clansman who might be called upon to defend his home, his family, and his chief. The gleam of polished steel was as much a part of the Highland dress as the tartan itself. It spoke of pride, of readiness, and of a long, martial tradition that stretched back into the mists of time. The right to bear arms was not a privilege granted by a distant king. It was considered an inherent right, woven into the fabric of the clan system. A man's weapons were often his most prized possessions, handed down from father to son, each nick and scratch on the blade a part of the family's story. The sword was a companion, a constant presence that offered a sense of security in a land where disputes could be sudden and violent, and where the law was often what a man could enforce himself. Even the simple act of walking through a glen felt different when armed. It was to walk with confidence, with honor. This is why the Disarming Act, a key component of the Act of Prescription passed in 1746, struck so deeply at the Highland psyche. On the surface, its purpose was simple and pragmatic, to prevent any future uprising by removing the means to wage war. The government decreed that all Highlanders were to surrender their weapons, swords, dirks, pistols, firearms of any kind. All were to be handed over to government officials under penalty of severe punishment. To be caught with a weapon after the deadline meant fines, imprisonment, or even transportation to the colonies for a second offense. The act was brutally effective. Redcoat patrols swept through the glens, searching homes, barns, and hidden caches in the hills, confiscating any weapon they could find. Piles of surrendered and confiscated steel grew at government forts like Fort William and Fort Augustus. Broadswords with intricate basket hilts, dirks with carved wooden handles, and long-barreled Lochaber axes were heaped together like common scrap metal. For the men who were forced to give them up, this was an act of profound humiliation. To hand over the sword that your grandfather had carried was to surrender a piece of your lineage. To be left with empty hands was to be made helpless, stripped not just of the ability to fight, but of the very symbol of your manhood and your freedom. It was a visible and public declaration of their defeat and subjugation. The act went even further, demonstrating the government's deep misunderstanding, or perhaps its canny understanding, of Highland culture. The law also banned the playing of the great Highland bagpipe. To the Hanoverian authorities, the bagpipe was not an instrument of music, it was an instrument of war. Its stirring, powerful sound had been used for centuries to rally clansmen for battle. Its pibrochs, the classical music of the pipes, often commemorating great battles or lamenting fallen chiefs. The sound of the pipes was the sound of the clan on the move, a declaration of intent and a call to arms. By silencing the pipes, the government aimed to mute the very soundtrack of rebellion. This part of the act was a particularly cruel blow. The bagpipe was the soul of Gallic culture, its music echoing through every part of life, from celebrations to funerals. The piper held a position of great honor within the clan, often trained for years in prestigious piping schools. To ban the instrument was to rob the people of their music, their ceremony, and a powerful expression of their collective emotion. The glens, which had once rung with the soaring notes of the pibroch, fell quiet. The silence was deafening. It was another layer of emptiness laid upon a land already stripped of so much. The loss of weapons changed the very posture of the Highland people. The confident, martial stride of the clansman was replaced by the stooped, cautious gait of a disarmed and defeated man. Disputes that might once have been settled by a show of strength or a formal duel now had to be endured in simmering silence, were taken to the alien English-speaking courts. The sense of personal agency was eroded. Without the means to defend themselves, people felt vulnerable, not just to the soldiers who patrolled their glens, but to any and all misfortune. Of course, not all weapons were surrendered. Many were hidden away, greased and wrapped in cloth, and buried in the peat or concealed in the thatch of a roof or in a remote cave high in the mountains. To keep a weapon was a dangerous act of defiance, a secret hope that one day they might be needed again. But for the most part, the Highlands were effectively disarmed. The policy worked. It made the people powerless, easier to control. The confiscation of weapons was more than a practical measure of military pacification. It was a symbolic act of emasculation. It was a statement that the Highlander was no longer to be considered a warrior, a free man with the right to defend his honor. He was to be a peasant, a laborer, a subject whose safety was no longer in his own hands, but in the hands of the very state that had crushed him. The dignity that came with the weight of a sword at one's hip was replaced by the hollow feeling of defenselessness. And in the profound quiet that followed, a quiet without the clash of steel or the song of the pipes, the people of the Highlands were forced to learn a new and bitter lesson: how to live on their knees.
In the wake of the 45 rebellion, long after the smoke from the burning crofts had cleared and the glens had fallen silent, a new and more insidious enemy began to stalk the Highlands. It was an enemy that could not be fought with a sword or driven back by a charge. It was hunger. The systematic destruction carried out by Cumberland's troops was not limited to burning homes. It was a scorched earth policy designed to destroy the very means of survival. The famine that followed Cullode was not an accident of nature. It was a direct and deliberate consequence of war and retribution. The traditional Highland economy was a fragile one, based on a delicate balance of subsistence agriculture and animal husbandry. The cornerstone of this system was cattle. For centuries, black cattle, or Cullode, were the measure of a clan's wealth. They provided milk, butter, cheese and hides. They were a form of currency, used to pay rent and to trade for essentials like salt and iron. Each summer, the cattle were driven to high summer pastures, a practice known as transhumance, which allowed the lower-lying fields near the townships to be cultivated for oats and beer, a type of barley. This rhythm of life, moving between the winter town and the summer shealing, had sustained the Highland people for generations. The government forces understood this perfectly. In their punitive sweeps through the glens, they targeted the livestock with ruthless efficiency. Vast herds of cattle were driven off, either to feed the victorious army or to be sold at lowland markets for a profit. What couldn't be driven away was often slaughtered on the spot, the carcasses left to rot in the fields. The loss was catastrophic. It was as if the entire savings and pension fund of a nation had been wiped out overnight. Without their cattle, families had no source of protein, no dairy, and no means of earning the cash they now needed to pay rent to their new government-appointed landlords. The destruction extended to the crops as well. Soldiers trampled through the fields of oats and beer, destroying what they could. More devastatingly, they destroyed the tools needed to farm. Ploughs were smashed, scythes were broken, and seed grain for the next year's planting was either confiscated or burned along with the houses. The intricate communal system of agriculture, where families worked together on the shared run-rig strips of land, fell apart. With so many men killed in the battle, imprisoned or in hiding, there was a desperate shortage of labour. The women, children and old men who were left behind lacked the strength and the numbers to cultivate the land effectively. As the summer of 1746 turned to autumn, the scale of the impending disaster became clear. The harvest was meagre or non-existent. The stores of food that were meant to last through the long, harsh Highland winter were gone. A profound and desperate hunger began to set in. People were forced to rely on whatever they could forage from the land. They dug for roots and tubers, scoured the hillsides for berries and wild garlic, and gathered nettles and other edible weeds to boil into a thin, unsatisfying soup. The shorelines became a vital source of sustenance, with people spending hours searching for shellfish, crabs, and edible seaweed like dulse and carrageen. The staple that remained was oatmeal, but even that was in desperately short supply. A family's daily meal was often reduced to a small portion of thin gruel, little more than a handful of oats boiled in water, perhaps with a pinch of precious salt if they were lucky. This meagre diet provided just enough calories to stave off immediate death, but it was a recipe for malnutrition and disease. Scurvy and other deficiency diseases became rampant. People grew weak, their bodies wasting away. The constant gnawing pain of an empty stomach became a part of daily existence, a dull ache that overshadowed every thought and every action. The social fabric, already frayed by the breaking of the clans, was further shredded by the famine. The traditional Highland values of hospitality and sharing were tested to their limits. When a family has barely enough to feed its own children, there is little to spare for a neighbour. Communities that had once been bound by mutual support became collections of isolated, starving households, each engaged in a solitary struggle for survival. The elderly and the very young were the most vulnerable, and the death toll from starvation and disease began to climb steadily through the winter of 1746 and into the following year. The landscape, once a source of pride and sustenance, became a stark reminder of their plight. The empty fields growing over with weeds were a constant testament to their inability to work the land. The heather on the hills, which had once seemed so beautiful, now looked barren and unforgiving. Every sight and sound was filtered through the lens of hunger. The cry of a seabird was a reminder of a potential meal. The sight of a deer on a distant ridge was a source of bitter frustration, for they had no weapons to hunt it. This period of starvation left a deep and lasting scar on the collective psyche of the Highland people. It was a time of quiet, desperate suffering, hidden away in the remote glens, largely unseen by the outside world. There was no grand drama, just the slow, grinding misery of empty bellies and fading hope. The hunger in the heather was the final, brutal lesson in the consequences of defeat. It taught the survivors that their connection to the land, their ancient skills, and their communal bonds were not enough to save them from the power of a state determined to break their spirit. It was a time when the greatest struggle was not against a human enemy, but against the simple, brutal reality of an empty pot and a barren field.
Language was more than just a means of communication. The Gaelic tongue, Gaelic, was the lifeblood of the culture. It was the language of poetry and song, of prayer and storytelling, of love and of war. It held within its very structure a unique way of seeing the world, a worldview shaped by the mountains, the sea, and the intricate bonds of the clan. The names of the hills, the lochs, and the glens were all in Gaelic, each name telling a story, describing a feature of the land, or commemorating an event. To speak Gaelic was to be in conversation with the landscape and with the generations of ancestors who had walked it before. It was the sound of home. After Cullode, The British government correctly identified this vibrant language as a key pillar of the distinct Highland identity they sought to dismantle. While there was no single, sweeping law that explicitly banned the speaking of Gaelic in all circumstances, a series of policies and institutional pressures was enacted with the clear aim of suppressing it and promoting English as the language of loyalty, progress, and civilization. The campaign against Gaelic was subtle, pervasive, and profoundly effective. It was a slow cultural erosion that forced the language into the shadows. The most powerful tool of this policy was the education system. The Society in Scotland for Propagating Christian Knowledge, SSPC, had been establishing schools in the Highlands since the early 18th century. While their stated mission was religious and moral instruction, their linguistic goal was explicit: to root out the barbarous Gaelic language and replace it with English. After 1746, their efforts were redoubled, now with the full backing of the state. Children in these schools were taught exclusively in English. They were often punished, sometimes brutally, for speaking their native tongue, even in the playground. A child caught speaking Gaelic might be beaten or forced to wear a tally stick or a maida crotty, a stick of shame, around their neck until they heard another child speaking Gaelic to whom they could then pass it on. This created a deep and damaging rift within communities and even within families. Children were taught, implicitly and explicitly, that the language of their parents and grandparents was a thing of shame, a mark of ignorance and backwardness. They learned to associate English with opportunity, advancement, and modernity, and Gaelic with poverty, failure, and the defeated past. A wedge was driven between the generations. The traditional role of elders as the keepers of wisdom and story was undermined when the very language they used to transmit that knowledge was devalued. The suppression of Gaelic was also felt in the legal and administrative spheres. As we have seen, the new courts and local governments conducted all their business in English. For a monoglot Gaelic speaker, this was a terrifying and disempowering experience. Imagine being accused of a crime or being part of a land dispute and unable to understand the charges against you, the evidence presented, or the judgment handed down. Justice became something that was done to you by outsiders in a language you couldn't comprehend. Contracts, eviction notices, and new laws were all written in English, leaving the Gaelic-speaking population vulnerable to exploitation and misunderstanding. As a result of these pressures, Gaelic began to retreat from public life. It became a language spoken indoors, by the hearth, away from the ears of teachers, ministers, landlords, and government officials. It became a language of whispers and shadows. To speak it openly in a town or in the presence of strangers was to risk being marked as disloyal, as a holdout from the old rebellious ways. People became cautious, code-switching to a broken, halting English when necessary, and saving their mother tongue for the safety of their own homes. This retreat had a devastating effect on the richness of the language itself. Gaelic was, and is, an incredibly rich oral culture. Its strength lay in its epic poems, its intricate songs, its thousands of proverbs and folk tales. This culture was sustained by public performance, by the bards in the chief's hall, by the storytellers at community gatherings, by the singers at weddings and funerals. As these public forums disappeared and the culture of fear set in, the great river of Gaelic oral tradition began to shrink to a trickle. The long, complex poems were forgotten. The songs were no longer sung openly. The language of public oratory and high art began to atrophy, replaced by the simpler, more domestic language of the fireside. What was being lost was not just a collection of words, but an entire universe of meaning. The intricate vocabulary to describe the weather, the sea, the different types of land, and the subtle shifts in the light on a mountainside began to fade from common use. The erosion of the language was the erosion of identity. Without the words to describe their world and their history, the people's connection to both began to weaken. They were being made strangers in their own land, their tongues tied by fear and shame. For those who continued to cherish it, Gaelic became a secret code, a quiet act of defiance. A lullaby sung to a child in Gaelic was a small rebellion. A story told by a grandmother in the old tongue was an act of cultural preservation. But it was a culture fighting for its life, pushed to the margins, spoken in the shadows. The slow silencing of Gaelic was one of the most tragic and long-lasting consequences of the post-Culloden era. It was a quiet, internal form of destruction, a hollowing out of the soul that left a silence in the glens almost as profound as the silence of the empty, burned-out homes.
The clan chief was the sun around which the Highland world revolved. He was the ultimate authority, the protector, the patriarch, and the living embodiment of the clan's history and honor. The bonds of loyalty that tied a clansman to his chief were absolute, often stronger than any allegiance to a distant king or an abstract notion of a state. The chief's hall was the center of political, social, and cultural life. It was here that disputes were settled, strategies were planned, poets recited their praise poems, and the clan gathered to reaffirm its identity. The presence of the chief on his ancestral lands gave the entire system its stability and its meaning. In the immediate aftermath of Culloden, this central pillar of Highland society was violently knocked away. The government's retribution was swift and targeted directly at the leadership of the rebellion. For the chiefs who had led their men onto the field for the Jacobite cause, there were only three possible fates: death, imprisonment, or exile. Many were captured in the brutal mopping-up operations that followed the battle. A series of high-profile trials was held in England, far from any sympathetic Scottish sentiment. Men like Lord Lovat, the wily and aged chief of the Frasers, and the Earl of Kilmarnock, chief of the Boyds, were tried for high treason, found guilty, and publicly executed on Tower Hill in London. These executions were designed as a spectacle, a graphic warning to any who might contemplate future rebellion. Faced with this grim reality, many other chiefs and prominent tacksmen chose to flee. The most famous fugitive was, of course, Prince Charles Edward Stuart himself, who spent 5 months as a hunted man in the Highlands and Islands before escaping to France. But countless others were also on the run, seeking passage on a French ship or hiding in the remote wild corners of their own lands. Men who had been masters of vast territories were reduced to living in caves, forests, and abandoned shielings, relying on the loyalty of their remaining clansmen to smuggle them food and warn them of approaching redcoat patrols. For many, this desperate existence ended in capture. For a lucky few, it ended with a clandestine journey across the sea to France, Spain, or the Papal States, where they would live out the rest of their days in exile, their fortunes gone, dreaming of the glens they would never see again. This sudden and complete removal of the traditional leadership created a massive power vacuum. The clans were left headless, rudderless in a sea of chaos. The very people they had looked to for guidance and protection for centuries were now dead, imprisoned, or vanished across the water. There was no one to issue orders, no one to organize a defense, no one to appeal to for justice or aid. The chain of command was shattered. This leadership vacuum was precisely what the government had intended. It made the subjugation of the Highlands infinitely easier. A scattered, leaderless people is far less capable of organized resistance. The lands of the executed and exiled chiefs were forfeited to the crown. As we have seen, these forfeited estates were then put under the management of government-appointed factors. These men were outsiders, often from the lowlands or England, who had no understanding or sympathy for the Gaelic way of life. Their primary objective was to make the estates profitable and to impose improvements, a word that to the Highlanders often meant radical, unwelcome change. The traditional farming of communal land was dismantled in favor of enclosed fields and individual tenancies. Rents were rationalized and increased and demanded in cash, a commodity that was still scarce. The new masters of the land were distant and impersonal. The old paternalistic relationship between chief and clan was gone, replaced by a cold commercial one between landlord and tenant. There was no longer any sense of shared heritage or mutual obligation. A clansman could be evicted from the land his family had farmed for 500 years simply because he could not pay the new rent. This new class of landlord had no interest in preserving the social fabric of the clan. In fact, their instructions were often to break it. For the clans whose chiefs had supported the government, the Campbells, the Monroes, the Sutherlands, the situation was different, but the end result was often similar. These chiefs kept their lands and their titles, but their traditional role was also irrevocably altered. The abolition of heritable jurisdictions stripped them of their legal powers. The Disarming Act removed their military function. They were encouraged by the government to think of themselves not as patriarchal chieftains, but as modern, improving landlords in the English style. Many embraced this new role, spending more time in London or Edinburgh than on their own estates. They became disconnected from their people, their interests diverging. The pursuit of profit from their lands, whether by raising rents, enclosing land for sheep farming, or other commercial ventures, often took precedence over the welfare of their clansmen. In a sense, all the chiefs were lost, whether to the executioner's axe, to exile, or to the lure of a new identity as a modern aristocrat. The flight, execution, and transformation of the chiefs marked the end of an era. It left the common Highlander bereft of leadership, exposed and vulnerable. The central organizing principle of their entire world had been removed, leaving a void that was filled by the impersonal and often hostile power of the state and the market. The people were like a flock without its shepherd, scattered on the mountainside with the wolves closing in. The collapse of the traditional authority structure was a fundamental blow, one from which the old Highland way of life would never recover.
A vast, wild territory of mountains, bogs, and lochs, it was a landscape with few roads worthy of the name. Travel was difficult, often following ancient drove roads or rough hill tracks that were impassable for wheeled vehicles and treacherous in bad weather. This very inaccessibility was a form of defense. It made the Highlands a difficult place for an invading army to penetrate and control. It allowed the clans to live in relative isolation, governing themselves according to their own customs, largely beyond the effective reach of the central government in Edinburgh or London. The landscape itself was a guardian of their independence. After Culloden, the British government was determined to tame this landscape, to open it up, and to bring its rebellious inhabitants under permanent surveillance. The goal was to turn the remote glens from a hidden refuge into an occupied territory. The most visible and enduring symbol of this new policy was a massive program of military road and bridge construction. The project had actually begun decades earlier under General George Wade, but it was pursued with renewed vigor and strategic purpose after the 45. Under the direction of Wade's successor, Major William Caulfield, a network of over 1,000 miles of new roads was surveyed and built, cutting through the heart of the Highlands. These were not gentle country lanes, they were feats of military engineering designed for the rapid movement of troops and artillery. Great lines were driven straight up and down steep hillsides with little regard for the gradient. Rivers were spanned with sturdy, multi-arched stone bridges, many of which still stand today. The work was carried out by soldiers who were quartered in camps along the routes. For the local Highlanders, the sight of these roads being carved into their ancestral lands was a powerful and constant reminder of their defeat. The roads were scars on the landscape, physical manifestations of the government's power and reach. They were not built for the benefit of the local people, they were built to control them. Along these new military roads, and at key strategic locations throughout the Highlands, the government reinforced and expanded its network of forts and barracks.
Fort William, at the southern end of the Great Glen, was strengthened. In the middle of the glen, a new fort was built and named Fort Augustus, in honor of the Duke of Cumberland, whose middle name was Augustus. At the northern end, near Inverness, the colossal Fort George was constructed. This was one of the most advanced artillery fortifications in Europe, a vast, impregnable fortress designed to dominate the entire region and to serve as a secure base for the Royal Army. It was a statement in stone and earth, a declaration that the government was here to stay. From these forts and from smaller barracks scattered throughout the glens, redcoat patrols fanned out, constantly policing the new road network and the surrounding countryside. The presence of these soldiers was a daily reality for the Highland people. A flash of a red uniform on a distant path became a common and often dreaded sight. These patrols were there to enforce the new laws, the Disarming Act, the ban on tartan, and to gather intelligence. They monitored the movements of the local population, questioned travelers, and searched for hidden weapons or fugitive Jacobites. This constant surveillance created an atmosphere of fear and suspicion. The glens, which had once been places of sanctuary and freedom, now felt like open-air prisons. People had to be careful what they said, what they did, and who they were seen with. A casual conversation could be misconstrued. A gathering of friends could be seen as a potential conspiracy. The soldiers were a foreign presence, speaking a different language and representing the power that had destroyed their homes and their way of life. There was a deep and abiding mistrust between the occupied and the occupiers. The roads had other, more subtle effects as well. They opened up the Highlands to the outside world in a way that had never happened before. They brought in new people, new ideas, and a new cash-based economy. Lowland merchants, government officials, and even the first curious tourists began to travel along these routes, bringing the culture of the South with them. This influx further eroded the traditional Gaelic culture. The roads that were built to carry soldiers also carried the seeds of profound social and economic change, accelerating the decline of the old ways. For the Highlanders, the act of walking along one of these new roads was a complex experience. On the one hand, it made travel easier. On the other, it was a constant reminder of their subjugation. Every perfectly dressed stone in a bridge, every straight, unyielding line of the road spoke of the power that had defeated them. The roads were a tool of control, turning a wild and private landscape into a place that was mapped, measured, and policed. To be watched on the roads was to understand that you were no longer master of your own glen. The hills still had eyes, but now they were the eyes of the state, and they were always watching. The quiet paths where you could once walk with a sense of freedom were now corridors of surveillance, pathways of a new and unwelcome authority.
Rebellion. History often focuses on the deeds of men, the chiefs, the warriors, the political leaders. But in the quiet, desperate aftermath of Culloden, the burden of survival fell most heavily on the shoulders of the Highland women. While the men had been away fighting, and in the terrible silence that followed their defeat, it was the women who were left to face the immediate consequences of the government's retribution, and to hold together the shattered remnants of their families and communities. Theirs is not a story of grand gestures, but of immense, quiet, and often unrecorded endurance. In the wake of the battle, women across the Highlands were plunged into a state of profound loss. They were the ones who waited anxiously for news of their husbands, fathers, sons, and brothers. For most, the news that eventually trickled back to the glens was devastating. They learned of loved ones killed on the field, cut down in the brutal pursuit, or executed as rebels. Others were taken prisoner, destined for the rotting prison hulks on the Thames or the slow misery of transportation to the colonies. Still others were fugitives, hiding in the hills, unable to return to their families. In an instant, thousands of women became widows, their children fatherless, their homes bereft of the men who had been their partners and protectors. The grief was overwhelming, a deep, personal sorrow that was compounded by the collective trauma of the community. But there was little time or space to mourn. Survival was an immediate and all-consuming task. With the men gone, the women had to take on all the roles that had traditionally been shared.
They had to tend to the children, care for the elderly, and try to find a way to feed their families in a land that had been stripped bare. The government's scorched earth policy made this task almost impossible. Women returned from hiding in the hills to find their homes burned to the ground, their meager possessions destroyed. They saw their livestock, the family's main source of wealth and food, driven off by soldiers. The fields were untended, the tools were broken. They were left with literally nothing but the clothes on their backs and the hungry children clinging to their skirts. In this desperate situation, Highland women showed incredible resilience and resourcefulness. They became the primary foragers, scouring the landscape for anything edible. They taught their children how to find berries, roots, and shellfish. They wove makeshift shelters from turf and branches against the relentless wind and rain. They took on the back-breaking physical labor that the men would have done, attempting to cultivate small patches of ground with whatever primitive tools they could fashion. They also became the guardians of memory and culture. With the public life of the clan destroyed, the home became the last sanctuary of Gaelic tradition. It was the mothers and grandmothers who kept the language alive, singing ancient lullabies to their children, telling the old stories by the faint light of a peat fire. These were quiet acts of cultural defiance, ensuring that the next generation would not be entirely cut off from their heritage. They passed on the names, the histories, and the values of a world that had been all but erased. The psychological toll on these women was immense. They lived under a constant state of fear. The same soldiers who had killed their men and burned their homes now patrolled their glens. Women were vulnerable to assault and exploitation by the occupying troops. They had to navigate a new and dangerous world with no protection, relying on their wits and their courage to keep their families safe. They bore the weight of their own grief while also trying to shield their children from the trauma and hopelessness that surrounded them. The bonds between women became a crucial lifeline. In a society where the male-dominated clan structure had collapsed, women formed their own networks of mutual support. They shared what little food they had, helped care for each other's children, and provided emotional comfort in the face of shared loss. The sister, the mother, the neighbor. These relationships became the threads that held the tattered fabric of the community together. The story of the women left behind after Culloden is one of profound suffering, but it is also one of extraordinary strength. They were not passive victims of history. They were active agents of survival. They were the ones who ensured that life, in its most basic form, went on. They were the bridge between the old Highland world and whatever new world was to come. In the quiet glens, amid the ruins and the hunger, it was the steadfast, enduring presence of women that kept the embers of community and culture from being extinguished completely. Their resilience was the silent, unwritten epilogue to the battle, a testament to the human spirit's ability to endure even in the bleakest of times.
The mountains of the Scottish Highlands, the bens and the glens, have a timeless, enduring quality. They seem to stand apart from human history, their rocky faces shaped by ice and wind over millennia. But in the year 1746, the hand of man brought a terrible, fleeting violence to even the most remote of these landscapes. Fire, a force of nature, was weaponized and turned against the people. The policy of burning was not just about destroying homes, it was about scorching the earth, about making the land itself hostile to its own inhabitants, and about sending a terrifying message of power that could be seen from miles around. The term often used is the burning of croft houses, but the reality was the burning of entire communities, or clochans. These small townships were organic clusters of black houses, byres for the cattle, and small storage barns, all nestled together in a sheltered part of a glen. They were the living heart of the clan lands. The systematic burning of these clochans by government forces was a key part of the Duke of Cumberland's strategy of pacification. The logic was brutal and simple. A fugitive Jacobite cannot be sheltered if there are no houses left to shelter in. A rebellion cannot be sustained if the people have no food, no supplies, and no base of operations. The process of the burning was methodical and terrifying for those who witnessed it. A detachment of redcoats would march into a glen, their bright uniforms a jarring splash of color against the muted greens and browns of the landscape. They would move from house to house, often giving the inhabitants, usually women, children, and the elderly, only moments to flee with whatever they could carry. Then the soldiers would set to work. A torch made from bound heather would be lit and thrust into the dry thatch of the roof. The fire would catch quickly, a small flicker at first, then a rush of orange flame that would consume the entire structure in a shockingly short amount of time. The sound was as terrible as the sight, the roar of the flames, the sharp crack of burning timbers, and the hiss of the fire as it met the damp turf of the walls. The smell was suffocating, a thick, acrid smoke that filled the glen from one side to the other. The soldiers would move on to the next house and the next, until the entire clutchen was an inferno. They burned not just the homes, but the byres with the animals still inside, the stores of precious grain, and the stacks of winter fuel. Nothing was to be left. It was a strategy of total annihilation, designed to create a wasteland. From a distance, the effect was apocalyptic. A person hiding on a high ben or mountain could look down and see not just their own glen, but multiple glens sending up thick columns of black smoke into the sky. The smoke would smudge the horizon, blotting out the familiar shapes of the mountains. It was as if the land itself was being consumed. The bens, which had always been silent, eternal witnesses, were now wreathed in the evidence of this human cruelty. The phrase, "the burning of the bens," captures this sense of a violation that went beyond just property. It felt like a violation of nature itself. When the fires had passed, the landscape was transformed. What had been a living community was now a blackened, smoking ruin. The air would be thick with soot for days. The ground was charred and sterile. The ruins of the black houses stood like hollowed-out skulls, their stone walls stained black, their empty doorways and windows like vacant eyes staring out at the devastation. The once lively center of the glen was now a place of death and silence, punctuated only by the sad lowing of a surviving cow or the whisper of the wind through the scorched remains. The human cost was immense. Families were made homeless in an instant, cast out into a harsh and unforgiving landscape with winter approaching. They had no food, no shelter, and nowhere to go. Many sought refuge in caves or under overhanging rocks, trying to survive on whatever they could forage. The psychological impact was just as profound as the physical hardship. To see your home, the place of your birth, the repository of all your family's memories reduced to a pile of ash and rubble, was to experience a deep and shattering trauma. It was an act of profound degradation, a statement that your life and your history were worthless. The burning of the bens was a scorched earth tactic that had long-lasting consequences. It contributed directly to the famine that swept the Highlands in the following years. It broke the back of any potential for further resistance, and it permanently altered the settlement patterns of the region. Many of the burned-out clochans were never rebuilt. The population, decimated by war, hunger, and emigration, was too small and too scattered to re-establish the old communities. The land fell silent. Today, if you walk through some of the more remote highland glens, you can still find the faint traces of these lost townships. The faint outline of a stone foundation, a few scattered, fire-blackened stones, a small patch of unnaturally green grass where a byre once stood. These are the ghosts of the burning time, a subtle but powerful reminder of the year when fire was set to the mountainsides and entire communities were wiped from the face of the earth, leaving behind only ash, smoke, and a silence that would endure for generations.
None is more iconic or more instantly recognizable than tartan. The patterned woolen cloth, with its intricate crisscrossing lines of color, known as a set, was more than just clothing. It was a statement of identity, a visual declaration of a person's clan, their region, and their place in the world. The belted plaid, or feilemore, was a large, versatile garment, a single piece of tartan cloth that could be pleated and belted at the waist, with the rest draped over the shoulder and pinned, or pulled over the head as a cloak against the weather. It was a practical garment, perfectly suited to the damp, rugged Highland environment, serving as clothing by day and a warm blanket by night. The colors of the tartans were derived from the local plants and lichens used for dyes, which meant that different districts often had their own characteristic patterns and color schemes. Over time, these regional patterns became more formalized and associated with specific clans. To wear the tartan of your clan was to wear your allegiance on your body. It was a uniform of kinship, a vibrant, moving tapestry that displayed the loyalties and the diversity of the Highland people. The sight of a clan army on the march, a river of colorful tartan flowing across the moor, was a powerful and intimidating spectacle, a visual representation of the clan's strength and unity. Because of this powerful symbolism, the British government saw the wearing of Highland dress as an act of defiance, a perpetuation of the very clan identity and martial spirit they were determined to crush. In 1746, as part of the Act of Proscription, they passed the Dress Act. This law made it illegal for any man or boy in Scotland, with the exception of those serving as soldiers in the British Army's Highland regiments, to wear what was termed the Highland garb. The law was specific, banning the plaid, the kilt or philibeg, the trews, tartan trousers, and any part of the Highland dress. The only garment explicitly permitted was the tartan plaid worn by women. The penalty for breaking the law was severe. A first offense resulted in 6 months' imprisonment. A second offense was punishable by transportation to one of the colonies for a term of 7 years. The law was enforced rigorously. Soldiers on patrol had the authority to stop any man they saw wearing the forbidden clothes and to strip him on the spot. Tales abound of men having their kilts forcibly removed on the roadside and being forced to continue their journey in just their long linen shirt, an act of utter humiliation. The impact of the Dress Act was profound and deeply personal. It was an attack on the very image of the Highlander. It forced an entire population to change the way they looked, to abandon the clothes their ancestors had worn for centuries, and to adopt the unfamiliar and, in their eyes, effeminate and impractical breeches and coats of the Lowlands and England. For a man accustomed to the freedom of movement of the kilt, the tight-fitting breeches were restrictive and uncomfortable. The fabrics were often ill-suited to the wet and boggy conditions of the Highlands. But the loss was far more than a matter of comfort or practicality. It was a loss of identity. To be stripped of your tartan was to be made anonymous. A MacDonald could no longer be visually distinguished from a Campbell or a MacLeod. All were reduced to the same drab, government-sanctioned attire. It was a deliberate policy of cultural homogenization, an attempt to make the Highlander look like everyone else, and therefore to think like everyone else. The vibrant, colorful landscape of clan identity was painted over in a single, monotonous shade. The band created a strange and alienating world. Men who had taken immense pride in their appearance, in the specific set of their tartan, and the way they wore their plaid, now felt awkward and diminished in their new clothes. It was a constant daily reminder of their defeat and their subordinate status. Every time they dressed in the morning, they were forced to comply with the new order. The law was a form of psychological warfare, chipping away at the people's sense of self-worth and their connection to their own heritage. Like the ban on weapons and bike pipes, the Dress Act was a symbolic act of castration. It aimed to tame the wild Highlander, to strip him of his martial and cultural pride. It is a strange irony that the very uniform the government banned at home, the kilt and tartan of the Highland regiments, was becoming famous across the British Empire as a symbol of the Scottish soldiers' ferocity and courage. The government recognized the power of the Highland dress and sought to co-opt it for its own military purposes while simultaneously eradicating it from its native soil. The Dress Act remained in force for 35 years, a full generation.
By the time it was repealed in 1782, its work was largely done. The tradition of wearing the kilt as a daily garment had been broken. An entire generation had grown up knowing only the lowland dress. When the ban was lifted, the kilt and tartan did not immediately return as everyday wear. They began a new life as a form of ceremonial or romantic dress, a self-conscious revival rather than a living tradition. The law had successfully created a disconnect, a break in the long chain of cultural transmission. There was now no place for tartan in the everyday life of the glens, and in its absence, a vital, visible thread of the old Highland identity was lost forever.
The hearth, the central fire in a Highland black house, was much more than a place for cooking and warmth. It was the symbolic heart of the home, the focal point of family life. Around the gentle glow of the peat fire, stories were told, songs were sung, and the day's news was shared. It was a place of community and continuity. An empty, cold hearth was a powerful symbol of desolation and loss. In the years following Culloden, across the vast expanse of the Highlands, countless hearths fell cold, and the fields that surrounded them fell silent, mirroring the emptiness in the homes and in the hearts of the people. The desolation began with the physical destruction. As we have seen, the burning of the clachans left behind a landscape of ruins. But even in glens that were spared the torch, the aftermath of the battle created a hollowing out of communities. The loss of so many men to the battle itself, to the gallows, to prison, or to exile, tore the heart out of the workforce. The intricate communal farming system of the Highlands relied on a delicate balance of labor. The men did the heavy work of plowing and digging, while the women, children, and elderly took on other essential tasks like sowing, weeding, and herding. With the men gone, this system collapsed. A field that would normally have been worked by a dozen strong men might now be left to a handful of grieving women and old men. They lacked the physical strength, the tools, which were often destroyed, and the draft animals, which had been driven off. The result was inevitable. The run rigs, the narrow strips of cultivated land that snaked across the floor of the glens, began to fall into disuse. Patches of land that had been painstakingly cleared of stones and nurtured for generations were left fallow. The neat patterns of cultivation that had once marked a living, working landscape began to blur as bracken, heather, and weeds crept back in, reclaiming the land. The agricultural calendar, a rhythm of life that had been followed for centuries, was broken. The time for plowing, for planting, for cutting the peat, for moving the cattle to the summer sheelings, all these familiar beats of the year were disrupted. The knowledge of how to work the land, passed down through generations, was of little use when the means to do so were gone. The land itself seemed to be in mourning, its fertility wasted, its potential untapped. The silence of the empty fields was a profound one. It was a silence that spoke of lost labor, of failed harvests, and of a deep communal despair. This agricultural collapse was the primary driver of the great hunger that followed. With the fields lying empty, there was no crop of oats or berry to harvest. The crucial winter store of food, which was always precarious even in the best of times, was now non-existent. The emptiness of the fields translated directly into the emptiness of the stomach. The two were inextricably linked. A walk through a glen in 1747 would have been a walk through a landscape of failure. The sight of the untended earth was a constant, painful reminder of the community's brokenness and its inability to provide for itself. The empty hearths within the ruined or simply abandoned homes told the same story. A cold hearth meant no warm food, no light in the darkness, no gathering place for a family. It was the ultimate symbol of a home that had ceased to function.
For families who had managed to survive, huddled in makeshift shelters or in the corner of a ruined byre, the memory of the warm, glowing hearth of their old home must have been a source of profound sorrow. It represented a lost world of security, community, and sustenance. The psychological impact of this emptiness cannot be overstated. The Highlanders' connection to their land was deep and spiritual. The land was not just a resource, it was their inheritance, the place of their ancestors. To see it lying barren and untended was to witness the failure of their own stewardship. It induced a sense of lethargy and hopelessness. The motivation to work was crippled by grief, by hunger, and by the knowledge that any surplus they might produce would likely be taken by the landlord or the government in the form of rent or tax. The emptiness was also literal. Entire glens that once supported several hundred people were now home to only a few scattered families, or were abandoned altogether. The footpaths that had connected the clachans became overgrown. The summer shielings high in the hills, once a place of laughter and hard work, stood empty and silent. The landscape was being hollowed out, its human presence fading. This was the beginning of a process that would culminate in the great highland clearances of the next century, but its roots lie here, in the immediate aftermath of Culloden, in the cold hearths and the silent, untended fields. It was a time when the very soil itself seemed to be grieving, lying dormant beneath a heavy blanket of sorrow, waiting for a spring that for many would never come.
Before 1746, the music of the pipes, the chol mor, the great music, and the chol beg, the little music, was woven into the very fabric of Highland life. The pipes were not just for entertainment, they were a vital part of the social and military structure of the clan. The sound of the pipes could signal a gathering, lead men into battle, celebrate a wedding, or, most poignantly, lament the passing of a chief. The piper, or piobere, was a figure of immense prestige within the clan. He was a professional musician, often from a long line of pipers, like the MacCrimmons of Skye, who served as hereditary pipers to the MacLeods. These men were highly trained artists who attended formal piping colleges where they would spend years memorizing and mastering the vast and complex repertoire of pibroch, the classical music of the pipes. A pibroch is a sophisticated musical form, a theme and variations that can last for up to 20 minutes, each piece telling a story, commemorating a historical event, or expressing a deep emotion. The piper was a historian and a poet, his music a living archive of the clan's glory and its grief. To the British government, however, this powerful music was not art, it was sedition. They saw the bagpipe as an instrument of war, a tool used to incite the wild Highlanders to rebellion. They had heard its stirring, martial tunes on the battlefields of Prestonpans and Falkirk, and they recognized its power to rally and inspire. As a result, in the sweeping Act of Prescription of 1746, the government took the extraordinary step of classifying the bagpipe not as a musical instrument, but as a weapon of war. And just like the broadsword and the dirk, it was banned. The law made it a criminal offence to play the pipes or even to possess them. To be caught doing so carried the same harsh penalties as being caught with a firearm. This edict fell like a stone into the deep well of Highland culture, creating a silence that was shocking in its totality. The glens, which for centuries had echoed with the sound of the chanter and drones, fell quiet. The music that had marked every significant moment of life, from the cradle to the grave, was suddenly gone. The silencing of the pipes was a profound cultural blow. It was an attempt to mute the very soul of the people. Imagine a wedding without its celebratory reel,
a funeral without its mournful lament, a community gathering without the familiar sound that brought everyone together. The silence was an amputation. It removed a fundamental form of expression, leaving a void that could not be filled. The great pibrochs, with their complex stories of battles and heroes, began to lose their context. Without the public occasions to perform them, and with the fear of punishment hanging over every piper, this intricate oral tradition was put in mortal danger. Of course, the music did not die out completely. It went underground, just like the fugitives and the forbidden weapons. Pipers would practice in secret, in remote glens or hidden caves far from the ears of the redcoat patrols. Some tried to preserve the music by translating it into other forms. A system of notation called cantericht developed, where the notes of the pipe tune were sung using a series of vocables or meaningless syllables. A piper could keep a tune alive in his head by singing it to himself, a silent internal act of musical preservation. But this was a faint echo of the real thing, a shadow of the powerful, resonant sound of the instrument itself. The ban lasted for over 30 years. By the time it was lifted, a full generation had grown up in a world without the public sound of the pipes. The great piping schools, like the one run by the MacCrimmons, had long since closed their doors. Many of the master pipers of the 45 generation had died, taking their vast knowledge of the pibroch repertoire with them to the grave. While the tradition survived, it was wounded and diminished. A vital link in the chain of oral transmission had been broken. When the pipes began to be heard openly again in the late 18th century, it was in a different world. The clan system was gone, and the social context that had given the music its meaning had vanished. The bagpipe began its slow transformation from a living, integral part of a warrior society to the symbol of a romantic, vanished past that we often see it as today. The silence of the bagpipes in the years after Culloden was one of the most poignant consequences of the defeat. It was a deliberate, calculated act of cultural suppression. By banning the instrument, the government sought to erase a sound that was synonymous with Highland identity and defiance. They succeeded in creating a long, quiet interlude in the musical history of a nation, a period when the glens were filled with an unnatural stillness, and the very air seemed to be missing its most essential voice.
For the people of the Highlands, the land was not just a place to live, it was the core of their identity. The glens, mountains, and islands were their ancestral home, the ground that held the bones of their forebears and the stories of their clan. To be forced to leave this land was a fate almost as bad as death. In the years following Culloden, this fate befell thousands of Highlanders who were swept up in a great, tragic wave of exile and emigration that would change the face of the Highlands forever. This dispersal happened in two main ways: forced transportation and voluntary, though often desperate, emigration. The first wave consisted of the Jacobite prisoners. After the battle, hundreds of captured clansmen were crammed into prisons in England and Scotland. After summary trials, many were sentenced to transportation to the British colonies in the Americas and the West Indies. They were treated not as prisoners of war, but as felons. Packed into the dark, disease-ridden holds of transport ships, they endured a horrific journey across the Atlantic. Many did not survive the voyage. Those who did were sold as indentured servants to plantation owners, condemned to years of hard labor in a climate and a society that was utterly alien to them. They were cut off from their families, their language, and their culture, with little hope of ever returning home. For those left behind, this was a particularly cruel form of loss. A man killed in battle had a grave, a place in the community's memory. A man transported simply vanished over the horizon. Families would receive no word of their fate, left to wonder for years if their loved one was alive or dead. This gaping uncertainty was a wound that could not heal, a permanent absence at the heart of the family. Alongside this forced exile, a new and much larger wave of emigration began. This was technically voluntary, but the choice was often made under extreme duress. The old Highland way of life was being systematically dismantled. The clan system was broken, the lands were being managed for profit by new landlords, and rents were rising steeply. The famine and economic hardship that followed the rebellion made life precarious and often unbearable. For many families, the choice was not between staying and leaving, but between leaving and starving. North America, particularly the colonies that would become the United States and Canada, was presented as a land of opportunity. Shipping agents and landlords, who often wanted to clear their land for more profitable sheep farming, actively encouraged emigration. They painted pictures of a vast, fertile land where a man could own his own farm and build a new life. For a family living in a turf hovel on a small, exhausted patch of land, the promise was a powerful lure. The decision to leave was an agonizing one. It meant abandoning the only home they had ever known, the landscape that held all their history and all their memories. It meant saying goodbye to kinfolk, knowing they would almost certainly never see them again. The departure of an emigrant ship was a scene of profound and public grief. Entire communities would gather at the shore to watch their friends and relatives leave. The sound of weeping would mingle with the cries of the gulls as the ship weighed anchor and slowly disappeared from view. This leave-taking, known as an inrick, the flitting, became a defining and traumatic feature of Highland life. The emigrants took with them what little they could carry, a few clothes, a Bible, perhaps a handful of soil from their home glen. They also carried with them their language, their music, and their memories. In the New World, these Highland communities often settled together, trying to recreate a shadow of the life they had lost. They named their new settlements after the places they had left behind: a new Inverness, a new Skye. In the vast forests of North Carolina, on the wind-swept shores of Nova Scotia, and in the glens of the Appalachian Mountains, they preserved their Gaelic language and traditions for generations. They became the seed of the great Highland diaspora that now stretches across the globe. But for those who remained in Scotland, the emigration was a hollowing out. It drained the glens of their people, particularly the young and the ambitious. With each ship that departed, the communities grew smaller, quieter, and older. The fabric of society became thinner and more fragile. The loneliness of the landscape deepened. An abandoned, roofless croft was no longer just a sign of the burnings of 1746. It was now also a sign of a family that had gone across the sea. The exile of so many of its people was one of the most profound and long-lasting legacies of the post-Culloden era. It was a physical and emotional dispersal that tore apart families and communities. The people mourned not only the loss of their traditional way of life, but also the literal loss of their people, who had vanished over the Western Ocean. The wind that blew in from the Atlantic now seems to carry a new note of sorrow, a lament for the children of the glens who were now strangers in a strange land.
For a subsistence farmer in any part of the world, the weather is a constant preoccupation. It is a force of nature that dictates the rhythms of the year and determines the success or failure of the harvest. But for the Highlanders in the years after Culloden, watching the weather became an act of heightened anxiety and desperation. The fragile agricultural system that had sustained them for centuries had been shattered, and this made them more vulnerable than ever to the whims of the sky. The traditional Highland agricultural system was a marvel of adaptation to a difficult environment. It was a complex and communal endeavor, built on generations of accumulated knowledge. The people knew their land intimately. They knew which patches of soil were best for oats and which were better for potatoes. They understood the subtle signs that heralded a change in the weather, the way the clouds formed over a particular mountain, the behavior of the birds, the feel of the air.
This deep, local knowledge was a vital tool for survival. They knew when to plant, when to harvest, and when to bring the cattle down from the high sheilings before the first snows. After 1746, this system fell into disarray. The destruction of communities, the loss of manpower, and the collapse of the clan structure meant that this collective wisdom began to fragment. The experienced farmers were often gone, killed, imprisoned, or in hiding. The communal labor that was essential for major tasks like drainage and building dikes was no longer available. People were left to fend for themselves on small, individual plots of land, often with poor tools and no draft animals. In this new, precarious existence, the weather became an adversary of immense power. A late frost in the spring could wipe out the entire potato crop, a staple food that had become increasingly important. A summer drought could wither the oats in the field, leaving nothing to harvest. But the most feared weather was the rain. The highland climate is notoriously wet, but a prolonged period of heavy rain in the late summer, just before the harvest, was a catastrophe. It could flatten the oat crop, making it impossible to scythe. It could rot the stalks in the field and cause the grain that had been cut and stooked to sprout or go moldy. Imagine the anxiety of a family watching the sky day after day in August and September. They would have spent months of back-breaking labor cultivating their small patch of land. Their entire food supply for the coming year depended on a few weeks of dry weather to get the harvest in. Every dark cloud on the horizon would bring a fresh wave of fear. They would watch the sky with a desperate intensity, praying for sun, for a dry wind. A week of relentless driving rain was not just an inconvenience, it was a sentence of hunger for the long winter ahead. The lack of resources made them even more vulnerable. In the old days, a community could work together to bring in the harvest quickly if the weather threatened to break. Now, a single family might struggle for weeks to cut and gather their crop. They lacked the strong barns of the past, which had been burned. Their makeshift storage was often inadequate, and a successful harvest could still be lost to damp and mold during the winter months. This fragile agricultural existence was also hampered by the political and economic climate. The new landlords were often unsympathetic, demanding their rent in cash, regardless of whether the harvest had been a success or a failure. There was no safety net. In the old clan system, a chief might have waived the rent or provided food from his own stores in a year of bad harvest. The new factors and landlords felt no such paternalistic obligation. A poor harvest meant not only hunger, but also the threat of eviction. The psychological toll of this constant uncertainty was immense. It created a sense of powerlessness, a feeling that their lives were entirely at the mercy of forces beyond their control, both the impersonal force of the weather and the equally impersonal force of the new economic order. The simple act of looking out from a cottage door in the morning became freighted with meaning. Was the sky clear or cloudy? Was the wind from a dry or a wet quarter? The answer could mean the difference between sustenance and starvation. Watching the weather was no longer just a part of the farming life. It was the central drama of a life lived on the very edge of survival. It was a daily confrontation with the fragility of their existence in a world that had been turned upside axle down. The familiar patterns of the seasons, which had once provided a sense of order and predictability, now seemed fickle and threatening, another source of anxiety in a life already overloaded with grief and fear.
The generation of children born in the Highlands in the years immediately following Culloden grew up in a world of silence and shadow. They were the inheritors of a profound and often unspoken trauma, a loss that shaped their entire worldview. For these children, the vibrant, rich culture of their ancestors was not a living reality, but a collection of whispers, fragments, and forbidden memories. They were a generation raised in the quiet aftermath of a storm, and the psychological toll of this upbringing was deep and lasting. In the traditional Highland world, a child's upbringing was a deeply communal affair. A child was not just the responsibility of its parents, but of the entire clochán, the extended family of the clan. From the moment they were born, they were immersed in a rich, sensory world of Gaelic culture. They would have been surrounded by the sound of the language, the music of the pipes and the harp, the rhythm of the work songs sung in the fields. Their evenings would have been filled with storytelling, as elders recounted the great epic poems, the folk tales, and the history of their clan. Their identity was formed by this constant, nourishing stream of culture. They knew who they were, where they came from, and what their place in the world was. The children of the post-Culloden era were denied this inheritance. They grew up in a world where the key elements of their culture had been outlawed or suppressed. The bright colors of the tartan were gone, replaced with drab, unfamiliar clothes. The stirring sound of the bagpipes was silenced. The Gaelic language, the very tongue of their parents, was spoken with caution, often hidden from the ears of outsiders. In the SSPC schools, they were taught that their native culture was a thing of shame, a mark of barbarism that had to be unlearned. This created a profound sense of confusion and alienation. The world of their parents and grandparents, a world of clans, chiefs, and warriors, seemed like a distant, half-forgotten dream. The stories they heard whispered at home were in direct contradiction to what they were taught in the schoolhouse. They were caught between two worlds, the fading world of their heritage and the dominant English-speaking world of the government and the new landlords. This internal conflict left many feeling like they belonged to neither. The absence of kin was another defining feature of their childhood. So many families had been shattered by the war and its aftermath. Children grew up without fathers, uncles, or older brothers who had been killed, imprisoned, or forced into exile. The traditional male role models were gone. The extended family network, which had been the primary source of support and education, was broken. A child might grow up with little knowledge of their own genealogy, their connection to the wider clan severed. The very word for kin, duchess, which also encompassed a sense of heritage and ancestral land, became a painful reminder of all that had been lost. The landscape itself, which should have been a source of wonder and belonging, was often a landscape of grief. A child might be told, "That pile of stones was once your grandfather's house," or, "On that field a great battle was fought, and many of our people fell." The land was haunted by the ghosts of the recent past. The fun and games of childhood were played out against a backdrop of ruin and poverty. This environment had a deep psychological impact. These children grew up in an atmosphere of fear, grief, and resignation. They learned from a young age to be cautious, to be quiet, not to draw their attention to themselves. The boisterous confidence that might have characterized an earlier generation was replaced by a more subdued and somber demeanor. They inherited their parents' sorrow, a sense of loss for a world they had never even known. This was the generation that was meant to be the first of the new Highlanders, loyal, English-speaking North Britons disconnected from their rebellious past. To some extent, the government's policy succeeded. Many did grow up with a weaker sense of their Gaelic identity. But the policy also created a deep well of silent resentment and a lasting sense of cultural dispossession. They were a generation set adrift, without the songs, the dress, or the stories of their ancestors to anchor them. They were children without kin, raised in the long, quiet shadow of defeat, and their experience would shape the future of the Highlands for a century to come.
Food is more than just sustenance. It is culture. It is community. It is comfort. A shared meal is a ritual that binds families and communities together. The flavors of a traditional dish can evoke a deep sense of home and history. In the Highlands, after Culloden, the diet of the people was stripped of all its cultural richness and reduced to its most basic, brutal function: the simple and often failing effort to keep body and soul together. The story of what they ate is a story of monotony, scarcity, and a constant, gnawing hunger. The cornerstone of the post-Culloden diet, its beginning and often its end, was oats. Oatmeal, in the form of porridge or oatcakes, had always been a staple of the Highland larder. It was a hardy grain that could grow in the poor, acidic soils and cool, wet climate of the north. But in the past, it had been just one part of a more varied and nutritious diet. Now, in the wake of the destruction of livestock and the failure of other crops, it became almost everything. The daily reality for most families was a meal of thin porridge, known in Gaelic as brachan. It was made by boiling a handful of oatmeal in a large quantity of water over a peat fryer, often for a long time to make the small amount of grain seem more substantial. It was a gray, watery gruel with little flavor and even less nutritional value. If a family was lucky, they might have a small amount of milk from a surviving cow or goat to enrich it. But for many, it was just oats and water. This was often the only meal of the day. Oatcakes, or aranquars, were another way to consume the precious grain. A stiff dough of oatmeal and water was flattened into a thin round and cooked on a hot, flat stone called a griddle, or grediel, placed over the fire. These oatcakes were hard and dry, but they were portable and could be kept for a time. A piece of oatcake might be all a person had to eat for an entire day while working or hiding. The one essential flavor that made this meager diet bearable was salt. Salt was not just for taste, it was a vital preservative and a necessary nutrient. But salt was a precious commodity. It had to be bought or produced by the laborious process of boiling seawater. For families with no money and no resources, even salt was a luxury. A diet of unsalted porridge and oatcakes was not only bland, but deeply demoralizing. With the traditional sources of protein, beef from their cattle, and to a lesser extent venison and salmon, which were now the protected property of the landlords, gone, people were forced to find protein wherever they could. They scoured the shorelines for limpets, mussels, and crabs. They fished for small brown trout in the burns. But these sources were often not enough. To supplement the meager ration of oats, people relied on foraging. The women and children would spend hours searching for anything edible that the land offered. In the spring, they gathered young nettles and wild garlic to boil as greens, providing a much-needed source of vitamins. They dug for the roots of plants like silverweed, which could be ground into a type of flour. In the autumn, they collected wild berries. But this foraging was a constant, time-consuming struggle, and the rewards were often small. The scarcity of food created a new and desperate kind of arithmetic in every household. A small bag of oatmeal had to be carefully rationed to last a certain number of weeks. Every mouthful was counted. The constant hunger was a physical pain, a dull ache that never went away. It led to weakness, lethargy, and a vulnerability to disease. The simple act of eating, which should be a source of pleasure and strength, became a source of anxiety. Was there enough tomorrow? Was there enough for the children? This diet of salt and oats, when it could be had, stands in stark contrast to the feasts of the old clan society. The memory of the chief's hall, with its roasted meat, its salmon, its plentiful ale and whiskey,
must have seemed like a dream from another world. The reduction of the diet to its barest essentials was another part of the great stripping away of Highland culture. It was a constant, physical reminder of their poverty and their defeat. Life was reduced to a simple, repetitive cycle: the search for food, the meager meal, and the long, hungry wait until the next one.
In the broken landscape of the post-Culloden Highlands, where famine was a constant threat and communities were struggling for bare survival, a new and relentless pressure was applied by the victors, the demand for money. The traditional Highland economy had been based largely on barter and payment in kind. A clansman paid his rent to the chief with cattle, with grain, or with military service. Cash was a rare and peripheral part of life, but the new order that was imposed after 1746 ran on money, and this created a crushing burden on a population that had almost none. The first and most significant burden was rent. With the clan chiefs dead, exiled, or transformed into modern landlords, and with the forfeited estates under the control of government factors, the old paternalistic system vanished. The new landlords and factors were not interested in loyalty or tradition. They were interested in profit. They began to demand rents in cash at regular intervals, regardless of the tenant's ability to pay. For a family whose cattle had been driven off and whose crops had failed, finding the money for rent was an impossible task. This forced many Highlanders into a new and terrifying world of debt. They might have to sell their last remaining cow or a precious family heirloom to raise the cash. They might have to seek work for pitifully low wages on one of the new military road-building projects or in the burgeoning kelp burning industry on the coasts. This shift from a subsistence economy to a cash economy was disorienting and often devastating. It turned independent clansmen into a rural proletariat, dependent on wage labor to survive. On top of the rent, there were other financial demands. The established Church of Scotland, the Kirk, collected a tynd or teend, which was a portion of the agricultural produce of the land. Although this had existed for a long time, its collection became more rigorous and impersonal in the new climate. There were also new government taxes to contend with. The state that had crushed them now demanded that they help pay for its upkeep. The consequences for those who could not pay were swift and brutal. The law was no longer in the hands of the clan chief, who might have shown leniency to a struggling kinsman. It was now in the hands of the sheriff courts, administered by officials who enforced the letter of the law without sympathy. The primary punishment for failing to pay rent was eviction. Eviction, or being put out of one's home and land, was a terrifying prospect. A sheriff's officer, often accompanied by a party of men, would arrive at the tenant's cottage and formally remove them and their possessions. The family would be left on the roadside with nowhere to go. Their house might be unroofed, the thatch and timbers pulled down to ensure they could not return. In a landscape where there was no spare housing and no social safety net, an evicted family faced almost certain destitution. They would be forced to wander the roads begging for food and shelter, or to build a squalid, makeshift hut on a piece of waste ground. Fines were another common form of punishment. A man caught with a piece of tartan or with a part of a weapon, or found guilty of poaching a salmon from a river that was now the landlord's private property, would be fined a sum he had no hope of paying. Failure to pay the fine could lead to imprisonment. The new prisons were grim, unhealthy places, and a sentence could easily become a death sentence. This system of rents, taxes, and fines was not just about economics, it was a tool of social control. It kept the population impoverished and dependent. It reinforced the new power structures, making it clear who was in charge. It was a constant, grinding pressure that wore down the spirit of the people. The fear of debt and the threat of eviction became a permanent part of the psychological landscape, as real and as menacing as the redcoat patrols. For a people who had once valued freedom and martial pride above all else, this new world of financial obligation and punishment was deeply humiliating. It was a quiet, bureaucratic form of subjugation, but it was just as effective as the burnings and the executions. It tied the Highlanders to a system they did not understand and could not escape, a system where the punishment for being poor was to be made even poorer, and where the ultimate price for failure was to be cast out from the land of your ancestors with the door of your own home barred against you.
The presence of a conquering army in a defeated land is always a source of tension and misery. But in the Highlands after Culloden, the relationship between the people and the government soldiers was particularly toxic. The Redcoats were not a distant, abstract authority. They were a constant, visible presence in the glens, a daily reminder of the bloody defeat and the subsequent humiliation. Their presence was like salt rubbed into the raw wounds of the community, preventing any chance of healing and creating an atmosphere of deep-seated fear, resentment, and mistrust. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, the soldiers were the instruments of the government's brutal retribution. They were the ones who had hunted down the fugitives, burned the houses, and driven off the cattle. For the Highland people, the sight of a red uniform was directly associated with the most traumatic events of their lives. A woman who saw a patrol marching down her glen would not just see soldiers, she would see the men who had perhaps killed her husband or burned her home. This created a chasm of hatred and fear that was almost impossible to bridge. As the initial phase of violence subsided, the role of the army shifted from active destruction to long-term occupation and policing. Garrisons were established in the new forts, Fort George, Fort Augustus, Fort William, and in smaller barracks scattered throughout the region. From these bases, regular patrols were sent out to enforce the new laws. They were the ones who would stop a man on the road to check he wasn't wearing tartan, or search a cottage for hidden weapons. They were the face of the oppressive new regime. The cultural and linguistic gap between the soldiers and the local population was immense. The vast majority of the soldiers were English or Lowland Scots. They spoke no Gaelic and generally held a deep prejudice against the Highlanders, whom they regarded as savage, lazy, and treacherous rebels. They saw the local culture with contempt and made little effort to understand it. For their part, the Highlanders saw the soldiers as a foreign, brutish force, ignorant of their customs and hostile to their way of life. This mutual animosity played out in countless small, daily interactions. A soldier demanding information from a Gaelic-speaking woman who could not understand him. A group of soldiers drinking in a local tavern, their boisterous behavior an intrusion on the quiet grief of the community. A patrol stopping a man and treating him with casual contempt. These small frictions built up over time, creating a permanent state of low-level conflict. The soldiers lived in a state of relative plenty compared to the starving local population. Their barracks were supplied with food and drink from the south, while the people outside their walls were living on thin gruel. The sight of well-fed soldiers was a bitter and constant provocation to a people racked by famine. There was also the ever-present threat of violence and abuse. While not all soldiers were brutal, the power imbalance was absolute. A soldier could harass, insult, or assault a local person with little fear of repercussion. The new English-speaking courts were unlikely to take the word of a rebel Highlander against that of a soldier of the king. This created a society that lived on two separate, parallel tracks. The Highlanders retreated into a world of silence and suspicion when soldiers were near. They would feign ignorance, hide what little they had, and avoid contact as much as possible. The soldiers, in turn, saw this behavior as proof of the Highlanders' innate deceitfulness, reinforcing their prejudices. The glens became places of unspoken tension, where a surface quiet masked a deep well of resentment. The very landscape was altered by the soldiers' presence. The new military roads they patrolled, the imposing stone forts they garrisoned, these were alien structures, symbols of a new power that had been imposed by force. They were constant physical reminders that the land was no longer truly their own. It was occupied territory. The presence of the soldiers prevented any sense of closure or peace from taking root. The trauma of 1746 was not allowed to become a memory. It was relived every day with every sighting of a redcoat. It was a deliberate strategy by the government to keep the population intimidated and to prevent any thought of future rebellion. But in doing so, they created a legacy of bitterness that would poison relations between the Highlands and the central state for generations. The soldiers were a living, breathing embodiment of the defeat, a constant source of salt in wounds that were never given a chance to heal.
Strangers in their own land. There is a unique and profound disorientation that comes from seeing a familiar world become unrecognizable. It is the feeling of being in exile in your own home. In the decades following Cullode, the people of the Highlands experienced a slow, creeping, and deliberate process of cultural erasure that left many feeling like strangers in the very glens that had raised them. The landscape looked the same. The mountains still stood, the lochs still reflected the sky, but the human world that gave it meaning was being systematically dismantled and replaced with something new and alien. This sense of alienation began with the law. The abolition of the traditional clan courts and the imposition of the English-language sheriff court system meant that justice was no longer a familiar communal process. It became a foreign ritual, conducted in a foreign tongue according to rules that no one understood. The very concepts of right and wrong, of property and obligation, were being redefined by an outside power. The law, which should provide a sense of order and security, became another source of fear and confusion. The changes to land ownership were just as disorienting. The land, which had been the clan's collective heritage, or dudkas, was now a commodity, a source of profit for a new class of landlord. The deep spiritual connection to the ancestral soil was replaced by the cold, hard reality of a tenancy agreement. A man could be evicted from the land his family had occupied for centuries by a piece of paper written in English. This turned the Highlander's relationship with his own land on its head. It was no longer his in any meaningful sense. He was merely a temporary occupant, his presence conditional on his ability to pay rent. The suppression of the visible and audible symbols of their culture was a constant, daily reminder of their new, subordinate status. As we've seen, men could no longer wear the clothes of their fathers. The sound of the bagpipes was gone from the glens. Even the language was under attack, devalued in the schools and useless in the courts. A person's very name, the clan name, that was a source of such pride, was now a mark of suspicion. The world was being stripped of its familiar cultural signposts, leaving people adrift in a sea of new imposed customs. New people began to appear in the glens, further reinforcing this sense of alienation. Lowland shepherds arrived to manage the vast new sheep farms that were beginning to replace the old townships. Government factors, tax collectors, and ministers from the south brought with them new ways of speaking, new ways of dressing, and new ways of thinking. The homogeneous Gaelic-speaking world of the old Highlands was becoming a more mixed and more conflicted society. The Highlanders were becoming a minority in their own homeland, their culture marginalized and looked down upon by the newcomers. Even the names on the land began to change. As new maps were drawn and new estates were registered, anglicized versions of the old Gaelic place names were often used, or new English names were given to farms and hills. This was a subtle but powerful form of cultural colonization. It was an attempt to write the old Gaelic world off the map, to replace its stories and memories with a new, state-sanctioned geography. The cumulative effect of all these changes was a profound sense of cultural dispossession. People began to feel that the world they had been born into was vanishing before their very eyes. The old certainties were gone, replaced by a bewildering and often hostile new reality. They were being asked to forget who they were, to abandon their traditions, their language, and their history, and to become something else, North Britons. But this new identity felt hollow and false. This feeling of being a stranger in one's own land is a deep and painful form of psychological exile. It creates a sense of melancholy and nostalgia, a longing for a lost world. It can lead to a feeling of hopelessness and resignation, a sense that the tide of history is against you and there is nothing you can do. The Highlanders of the late 18th century were living through this experience in real time. They were witnessing the death of their world and were being forced to navigate the strange, unfamiliar landscape that was being built on its ruins. They were still in the Highlands, but the Highlands they had known were gone, leaving them to wander, like ghosts, through a land that was no longer theirs.
The long memory. When a culture is attacked, when its public expressions are outlawed and its institutions are dismantled, it does not simply vanish, it goes underground. In the Highlands, after 1746, with the tartan banned, the pipes silenced, and the Gaelic language retreating into the home, the memory of the old ways and the trauma of the defeat were kept alive in secret, passed down from one generation to the next through the quiet, resilient channels of oral tradition. This was the long memory, a form of silent cultural resistance that ensured the story of the 45 and its aftermath would not be forgotten. The main vehicle for this long memory was the Gaelic language itself. While it was being suppressed in the schools and the courts, it remained the language of the hearth and the heart. In the safety of their own homes, away from the prying ears of the authorities, people continued to tell the old stories. Grandparents would gather the children around the peat fire and recount the tales of the great clan heroes, of the battles fought, and of the world as it was before the disaster of Cullode. These stories were not just entertainment, they were a vital act of cultural transmission, a way of teaching the younger generation about their identity and their heritage. A new and powerful body of folklore began to grow around the 45 itself. Stories of the battle, of the bravery of the clansmen, and of the cruelty of the Duke of Cumberland, who became known in Gaelic as Am Yalada, the butcher, were told and retold. The flight of Bonnie Prince Charlie became a modern-day epic, with tales of his narrow escapes, his loyal protectors, and his eventual sorrowful departure from the shores of Loch Nanuav. These stories transformed a brutal military defeat into a romantic tale of loyalty and noble sacrifice. They helped to make sense of the trauma, to give it meaning, and to preserve the honor of those who had fought and died. Poetry and song were perhaps the most powerful tools of the long memory. In the years after the battle, a wave of intensely sorrowful and angry Gaelic poetry was composed, much of it by women. These songs, known as Oren and Droch Shaith, the songs of the evil arrow, lamented the dead, cursed the victors, and mourned the loss of the Highland way of life. Poets like Sheelas na Chapech and the great Alistair MacDonald, Alistair Magmahib Hallister, created a body of work that captured the raw grief and rage of the time. These songs were not written down. They were memorized and sung in private, passed from person to person, from glen to glen. A lullaby sung to a baby could contain a hidden reference to the lost cause. A work song used for walking the tweed cloth could have verses that lamented a fallen chief. The music was a secret, encoded history of the people's suffering and their defiance. To sing these songs was a small, personal act of rebellion, a way of keeping the flame of memory alive in a time of darkness. The landscape itself became a repository of memory. A particular hill, a stream, or a ruined cottage would be associated with a story from the 45. People would point out the place where a fugitive had hidden or where a skirmish had taken place. The land became a mnemonic device, a living map of the past. By telling these stories, people rooted their history in the very soil beneath their feet, ensuring it could not be erased by new landlords or new maps. This long memory was, by its nature, a quiet and private thing. It was a culture of whispers, of hidden meanings, of stories told in the shadows. It was not about open defiance, which was impossible, but about endurance. It was about refusing to forget. This act of remembering was crucial for the survival of Highland identity. It provided a sense of continuity in a world of radical, disorienting change.
It gave people a connection to their past and a sense of who they were, even when the outside world was telling them they were something else. The stories, poems, and songs that were passed down through the generations in this way formed a powerful counter-narrative to the official government version of history. While the history books might speak of a just and necessary suppression of a backward rebellion, the long memory of the Highlanders told a different story. A story of a brutal conquest, of cultural destruction, and of a world that was lost, but not forgotten. It was this long, quiet, and stubborn memory that would eventually fuel the romantic revival of Highland culture in the 19th century, and that continues to shape the identity of the region to this day.
Emptied glens. A Highland glen is more than just a valley. It is a self-contained world, a natural corridor carved between mountains, with a river at its heart. For centuries, the glens were the arteries of Highland life, each one holding a community, a clochen, a network of families who had lived on that same land for generations. The life of the glen had its own rhythm, its own history, its own unique character. But in the years after Cullode, and increasingly into the next century, a profound and sorrowful transformation occurred. The glens began to empty. The process began, as we have seen, with the violence and destruction of 1746, the burning of the townships, the famine, and the immediate wave of exile created the first empty spaces. Entire communities were wiped out, leaving behind only the blackened stones of their homes. But this was just the beginning of a longer, slower hollowing out, a demographic collapse that would leave many glens eerily silent and deserted. The post-Cullode economic changes were a powerful engine of this emptying. The new landlords, focused on maximizing profit from their estates, came to a stark conclusion. Sheep were more profitable than people. A single shepherd could manage a vast flock of Cheviot or black-faced sheep on land that had once supported several hundred people in a traditional township. And so began the early stages of what would later become known as the Highland clearances. Families who had lived in a glen for centuries were seen as an obstacle to progress, an inefficient use of the land. They were systematically removed, their leases terminated, their homes often pulled down to make way for the great sheep walks. The result was a landscape of profound loneliness. A traveler walking through a once populous glen in the late 18th century would have encountered a scene of quiet desolation. Where there had once been a bustling clochen, with the smoke of peat fires rising from the cottage roofs and the sound of children playing, there was now only silence. The fields that had been carefully cultivated in the run-rig system were now vast, empty pastures, dotted with sheep. The only human presence might be a solitary shepherd and his dog, living in a small, isolated cottage. The paths that had once connected the townships became overgrown and faint. The small footbridges that crossed the burns fell into disrepair. The very infrastructure of human community was decaying. The silence in these emptied glens was a heavy, sorrowful thing. It was a silence filled with the ghosts of the people who had left. You could almost hear the echoes of the lost life, the laughter, the songs, the Gaelic chatter, in the whisper of the wind through the tall grasses that now grew over the ruins of the old homes. The visual evidence of the emptying was everywhere. The most poignant sight was the ruin of a pre-clearance township. You can still see them today. Clusters of collapsed stone walls, the outlines of the old houses and byres, all but swallowed by the bracken and heather. They are the archaeological footprints of a lost society. Each pile of stones represents an empty hearth, a family uprooted, a story cut short in that particular place.
This emptying had a deep effect on the psyche of those who remained. They were living in a world of ghosts and departures. They were surrounded by evidence of a richer, more populous past. This created a powerful sense of melancholy, a feeling that they were the last remnants of a dying culture, living amongst the ruins of what had been. The depopulation also broke the remaining bonds of community. With fewer people, the traditional systems of mutual support for the harvest, for building, for comfort in times of grief became impossible to sustain. Life became more isolated, more solitary. The emptied glen is one of the most enduring and tragic symbols of the changes that swept the Highlands after Culloden. It represents the victory of a new economic order over a traditional way of life. It is the physical manifestation of a policy that valued wool more than people, profit more than community. The great, beautiful, and lonely glens of the Highlands are not an ancient, untouched wilderness. Many of them are a man-made landscape, a landscape that was deliberately and systematically emptied of its people, leaving behind a silence and a solitude that still haunts the region to this day.
Law in a foreign tongue. Justice is not just about rules and punishments, it is about understanding. For a legal system to be perceived as fair, people must be able to comprehend the proceedings, to make their case, and to understand the judgment that is passed upon them. In the Highlands, after Culloden, the imposition of a new legal system, conducted almost exclusively in English, created a profound crisis of justice. For the majority of the population, who were monoglot Gaelic speakers, the law became a terrifying and incomprehensible force delivered in a foreign tongue. Before 1746, justice in the Highlands was a local and often personal affair. The clan chief, in his role as patriarch and judge, held his own regality court. These proceedings were conducted in Gaelic, the language of the people. The laws they followed were a mixture of ancient custom, clan tradition, and Scottish feudal law. While not always perfect, this system was at least familiar and accessible. A clansman could understand the charges, speak in his own defense, and comprehend the reasoning behind the chief's judgment. Justice was something that happened within the community. The Heritable Jurisdictions Act of 1746 swept this entire system away. The judicial powers of the chiefs were abolished, and the king's law, administered through a network of state-appointed sheriffs and judges, was extended into every corner of the Highlands. The language of these new courts was English, or a dense, formal lowland Scots that was just as unintelligible to a Gaelic speaker. Imagine the experience of a Highlander brought before one of these new courts. He is likely accused of a crime he may not even understand as a crime, perhaps poaching a deer on land that was once common hunting ground, or being in possession of a forbidden piece of tartan. He is brought into a formal courtroom, a setting completely alien to him. The judge, the prosecutor, and the clerks are all speaking a language he cannot follow. The charges are read out in a torrent of incomprehensible sounds. Witnesses give evidence, but he cannot understand what they are saying. He is asked to plead, but the question makes no sense. There were rarely any interpreters. The accused was left isolated and helpless, a silent observer in a process that would decide his fate. He could not challenge the evidence. He could not present his own side of the story. He could not appeal to the shared values and customs of his community. He was entirely at the mercy of a system that was not designed for him. The law, which is meant to be a shield, became a sword, wielded by strangers. The consequences were devastating. Miscarriages of justice were inevitable. People were convicted of crimes they did not commit, or received punishments that were wildly disproportionate to the offense, simply because of the language barrier. But the wider effect was to create a deep and abiding fear and mistrust of the law. The courts were no longer seen as a place to seek justice, but as a place of punishment and oppression. The law was something to be avoided at all costs. This legal alienation extended beyond the criminal courts. All civil matters, land contracts, debt disputes, inheritance, were also conducted in English. Lease documents, eviction notices, and other legal papers were written in a language that the tenants could not read. This left them incredibly vulnerable to exploitation by unscrupulous landlords and factors. They could be signing away their rights or agreeing to terms they did not understand, with no way of knowing it until it was too late. The imposition of law in a foreign tongue was a powerful tool of subjugation. It disempowered the Highland people, rendering them voiceless and legally invisible. It reinforced the idea that their own language and culture were worthless, of no account in the new world of state power and modern administration. It was another way of making them strangers in their own land, subject to rules they could not understand and punishments they could not contest. The scales of justice were not just unbalanced, they were written in a language that only one side could read. And that is no justice at all.
Cold graves and quiet hills. In the aftermath of a great trauma, one of the most important human rituals is the process of mourning. To bury the dead with dignity, to mark their graves, to remember their names, and to grieve for them openly are all essential parts of healing for individuals and for a community. In the Highlands, after the Battle of Cullode, even this fundamental solace was denied to the people. The dead were often left unburied or were interred in unmarked mass graves, their names lost to history, their memory a private sorrow buried deep in the quiet hills. The brutality began on the battlefield itself. In the immediate aftermath of the Jacobite defeat, the victorious government soldiers, under the orders of the Duke of Cumberland, showed little mercy. The wounded who were left on the field were systematically killed. For days, the moor was a horrific scene, with the bodies of the fallen left exposed to the elements. Eventually, they were gathered and buried, not in individual consecrated graves, but thrown into great pits dug into the moorland. These are the clan graves that can still be seen at Cullode today, marked now with simple stones bearing the names of the clans, MacDonald, Cameron, Fraser. But at the time, they were nothing more than anonymous trenches, a final, brutal indignity for the men who had died there. For the families waiting in the glens, there was no funeral, no body to bring home and lay to rest in the local kirkyard beside their ancestors. There was only the terrible uncertainty, and then the confirmation that their loved one was gone, their final resting place an unmarked pit on a desolate moor. This lack of a proper burial was a deep wound to the Highland psyche. In a culture that placed great importance on kinship and lineage, to be buried without ceremony, without a name, was to be truly lost. The quiet killing continued in the weeks and months that followed. In the punitive sweeps through the glens, fugitives who were captured were often executed on the spot, their bodies left where they fell. Others died of starvation or exposure while hiding in the hills. These men died alone, their bodies often not found for months or even years. They received no burial at all, their bones slowly reclaimed by the peat and the heather. The hills themselves became a vast unmarked cemetery. Even for those who died at home from famine or disease, a proper burial was not always possible. The community was so broken, so impoverished, that their traditional rituals of the wake and the funeral were often abandoned. A family might have to bury their own dead in a simple shallow grave near their ruined cottage, with no minister to say a prayer and no stone to mark the spot. The old kirkyards, the traditional burial grounds of the clans, saw fewer and fewer new graves. The continuity of generations, represented by the family plots, was broken. This absence of monuments, of marked graves, of public mourning, created a landscape of silent, unexpressed sorrow. The grief was immense, but it had nowhere to go.
It was turned inward, becoming a private family ache that was passed down through the generations. The names of the lost were remembered in whispered stories by the fireside, not carved on stone for the world to see. This lack of public memorialization was part of the government's strategy. They wanted the rebellion to be not just defeated, but erased, forgotten. They did not want martyrs' graves that could become sites of pilgrimage and future inspiration. They wanted the memory of the 45 to be buried as deeply and anonymously as the bodies of the dead themselves. And so, the sorrow of the people remained unspoken in the hills. It settled into the landscape, becoming a part of its atmosphere. The quietness of the depopulated glens, the melancholy of the mist-shrouded mountains, these seemed to reflect the unvented grief of the people. The dead were all around, their presence felt but unseen, their graves cold and unmarked. There were no monuments, no grand tombs for the fallen of the 45. Their only memorial was in the long memory of their kin, and in the quiet, sorrowful beauty of the hills that had become their final, silent resting place.
The Ghost of Cullode. A battle can be over in a matter of hours, but its ghost can linger for centuries. The Battle of Cullode, fought on a bleak, wind-swept moor on the 16th of April, 1746, lasted less than an hour. In that short, brutal span of time, the Jacobite army was shattered, and the hopes of restoring the Stuart dynasty to the British throne were extinguished forever. But Culloden was more than just a military defeat. It was a fault line in Scottish history, a moment that marked the death of one world and the violent birth of another. Its shadow fell long and dark over the Highlands, and its ghost still haunts the landscape and the collective memory to this day. The ghost of Culloden is first and foremost the ghost of a lost culture. The battle was the pretext for a systematic and deliberate dismantling of the traditional Gaelic way of life. As we have explored, the clan system, the very bedrock of Highland society, was broken by law. The weapons that signified a man's freedom and honor were confiscated. The tartan, the vibrant uniform of kinship, was outlawed. The bagpipes, the very soul of Gaelic music, were silenced. And the language itself, the repository of 1,000 years of poetry, story, and history, was pushed to the margins, branded as the tongue of rebels and savages. The ghost of Culloden is the ghost of this silenced, suppressed world, a world of chiefs and clansmen, of bards and pipers, a world that vanished in the smoke of the burning clachans. It is also the ghost of a people broken. The retribution that followed the battle was swift and merciless. The executions, the imprisonments, the forced transportations to the colonies, these were just the beginning. The famine that stalked the glens, the crippling poverty, the evictions, and the great sorrowful emigrations across the sea all stemmed from the defeat on that moor. Culloden broke the spirit of the Highland people, replacing their fierce pride and martial confidence with a deep and lasting sense of loss and resignation. This ghost is the memory of the empty hearths, the untended fields, the weeping at the shore as the emigrant ships departed. It is the quiet sorrow that settled into the glens and never truly left. The landscape of the Highlands became a testament to this loss, forever haunted by the battle's aftermath. The ruins of the burned and cleared townships, the faint outlines of the old run-rig fields now buried under grass, the imposing military roads and forts built to control the survivors, all these are physical traces of the ghost. A walk through a lonely, depopulated glen is a walk through a landscape shaped by the events of 1746. The silence that you hear is not the silence of pristine, untouched nature. It is the silence of absence, the quiet left behind when a whole society is erased from the land. The ghost of Culloden has also had a long and complex afterlife in the imagination. Over time, the brutal reality of the defeat and its aftermath was romanticized, transformed into a tale of heroic, doomed idealists fighting for a lost cause.
Bonnie Prince Charlie, a flawed and desperate military leader, became a tragic, romantic hero. The clansmen became noble savages, symbols of a wild freedom crushed by modernity. This romantic version of the story, popularized by writers like Sir Walter Scott, is itself a kind of ghost, a beautiful, melancholy spectre that often obscures the much harsher, messier truth of the period. But even today, the real ghost, the ghost of the trauma, remains. It can be felt on the battlefield itself, a place of profound and heavy sadness. It can be felt in the ongoing debates about land ownership and language in the Highlands. It lives in the music, in the Gaelic songs that still lament the losses of that time. It is a reminder that history is not just a series of dates and events, but a living force that shapes the present. The battle on Cullode Moor may have ended in less than an hour, but the quiet, brutal, and world-changing consequences of that hour have echoed down through the generations. The ghost of Culloden is the long, quiet echo of a world that was lost, a culture that was broken, and a silence that fell upon the hills, a silence that, if you listen carefully, you can still hear in the wind.